The film opens up with a British man recording an internet video for his fan channel dedicated to a musician named Tucker Crowe, an American rock star. The man, whose name is Duncan, goes on to explain that Tucker released an album named Juliet, which would go on to be his most popular album, but didn't receive the critical acclaim Duncan believes it deserves. Tucker apparently went through a tough breakthrough in 1993, which led him to quit performing shows, and his current whereabouts are a mystery. The scene cuts to a woman in her 30s, walking through the town one morning and narrating her thoughts on her current life. The woman's name is Annie, and she tells us that she's bored of her life, living in the same place she has always lived. Annie runs a local museum, the ownership of which she inherited from her father. Annie is Duncan's girlfriend, and she apparently fell in love with him the moment she met him. Initially, their relationship started out well. The two of them got along well with each other. However, as is the case far too often, they slowly began to have problems. The main cause of these problems is Duncan's obsession with another man, Tucker Crowe. Sometime in the future, Roz, Annie's younger sister, brings over her new girlfriend Carly to Annie and Duncan's home. The four of them have dinner, and the subject of having children arises when Carly asks Annie if she's a mother. Duncan quickly interjects and explains that the couple is happy without children, and that he believes the world doesn't need any more of them. Annie quickly stops him from rambling on, and it even seems that she disagrees with him. Carly then changes the subject and asks Duncan about Tucker Crowe, and he immediately offers to have her listen to his music, much to Annie's displeasure. The next day, Duncan is teaching a class, showing them a scene from the Wire TV show. He hands out a sheet of definitions of slang in the show that his class may not be familiar with. As Duncan walks out of his classroom after dismissal, he is stopped by a woman named Gina, who is sitting in his class. Gina has some questions about the Greek tragedy they just learned about, and Duncan is reluctant to answer her questions, until Gina reveals she is actually a trainee teacher observing different classes, and not a student. Meanwhile, Annie gets home from work to see that a parcel has arrived addressed to Duncan. She opens the parcel to see that it contains a disc titled Juliet, and an anonymous note that states that this disc will be of particular interest to him. Annie is not pleased as she rips open a parcel containing a pink dress that she bought for herself. She tries on the dress, but is disappointed that it doesn't fit as well as she would have liked it to. In frustration, Annie listens to the Juliet disc as she sits on the floor with her head in her hands. Back at the university, Duncan and Gina are sat drinking coffee together, discussing their mutual love for art. Duncan can't help but be critical of people who can't appreciate the music he likes, noting that most people at the university wouldn't even look up from their Sudoku if the next Bob Dylan was playing in front of them. Later that day, Duncan comes home to Annie trying to stop a smoke alarm going off, as she forgot she put the stove on when she started listening to the Juliet album. Duncan is pleasantly surprised that Annie is listening to Tucker Crowe. However, he doesn't recognize the song playing. Annie explains that he received a parcel, and she opened it to find the disc, apparently of an unreleased album from Tucker Crowe. Duncan is not pleased with the fact that Annie decided to listen to it before and without him, and he quickly takes the disc from her and finds a portable player to listen to it, while staring out into the harbor. Duncan eventually arrives back home, and apologizes to Annie for being upset over her listening to the album before him. Annie accepts his apology, and apologizes for the album being dreary, which upsets Duncan again, who is adamant that it is a masterpiece. Duncan storms off again, leaving Annie frustrated, stating that he doesn't want to spend this moment with someone who doesn't understand. The next morning, Duncan is ecstatic that his review of Juliet has received attention online, 157 comments to be exact. Annie smiles smugly as he receives a 158th from a user named Relic Master, who is critical of the album, which Annie admits is her. Duncan notes that Annie is being petty, and Annie tells him that she feels like putting a bullet in her mouth as Duncan exits the room. Annie arrives at the museum to find that the mayor, whose name is Terry, has come to see her. Terry is displeased with Annie's approach to running the museum, stating that he feels the museum needs more displays like shark eyes and rock and roll music, rather than old snapshots of random people. Rose interjects on Annie's behalf, arguing that the museum would be boarded up if it had not been for Annie. As the two of them argue, Annie's attention is turned elsewhere when she sees that she has received an email from someone claiming to be Tucker Crowe. The sender apparently agrees with Annie's critical review of Juliet, and even calls the people on Duncan's Tucker Crowe forum weird. It turns out the sender of the email is actually the real Tucker Crowe, and he explains to Annie that the rumors and conspiracy theories that Duncan and his fanatic friends have about him are all untrue. Tucker is a down-and-out former musician who is unemployed, though he still receives royalties for his music, and he resides in a garage behind his ex's house, who allows him to stay there as he is the father of their son, named Jackson. Tucker and Annie email back and forth, until Annie invites Tucker to come see her museum. Tucker, meanwhile, is being visited by daughter Lizzie, who he hasn't seen since she was 9. Tucker has been such an absent father that Lizzie is unaware that she has more siblings, and he was oblivious to the fact she's expecting a child of her own. Annie and Tucker continue to email each other, and both of them feel like they have something in common with one another and that they have wasted the past 2 decades of their lives. He advises Annie to not think of it as wasted time, as a significant chunk of time you think you've wasted is spent doing things that you enjoy. He wants to know more about Annie's situation, who is surprised. Annie voices her frustrations over Duncan not wanting children, even though she wants to, and that she barely has any conditional affection for her boyfriend, let alone unconditional love. Tucker apologizes, as he has the opposite problem, in that he has many children, and they're all reminders of his fear of responsibility. Eventually, Lizzie is headed back to the UK, as she's expecting her child to be born anytime soon. Tucker takes her to the bus stop, where he thanks her for coming to visit her father. The two of them embrace and Lizzie bid him farewell, calling him by his first name, though Tucker doesn't mind this at all, as he knows he hasn't exactly been the best father. Some time later, Duncan runs into Gina in the university car park. Gina questions him about his love for Tucker Crowe, which he admits that he's guilty of. Gina explains how she was unable to find Juliet anywhere, which prompts Duncan to stop Gina from getting on her bus. The two of them head over to Gina's place, where they listen to a Tucker Crowe song named "We're in Trouble" and drink wine together. Elsewhere, Annie admits to Tucker that she feels as if she is betraying Duncan by having an email affair with his favorite singer, while unbeknownst to her, Duncan and Gina are getting intimate with each other behind her back. We skip to Annie and Duncan sitting at a table in an Indian restaurant, and Duncan is coming clean about his infidelity. Annie is devastated that Duncan cheated on her, demanding to know who the woman is. Duncan reveals to Annie that he cheated on her with a work colleague named Gina, and that he's very sorry and couldn't live with the guilt any longer. Annie is disgusted by Duncan, mostly because Duncan is only admitting to being unfaithful to make himself feel better. The waiter comes over to give them their orders, but Annie storms off, leaving Duncan by himself. The next day, Duncan is collecting his belongings from the home he shared with Annie. The two of them have decided to finally go their separate ways, in the wake of Duncan's cheating. However, Duncan is very reluctant to go through with it, explaining how the boxes will get wet, as it's raining outside. Annie isn't accepting any of his excuses anymore, and the two awkwardly hug as Duncan takes his leave. Later that night, Annie and Roz are at a bar together, discussing Annie's breakup. Roz tries to persuade her that it's time she finds another man, and just then, a drunk young man asking both ladies for a dance approaches them. Both Annie and Roz turn the man down, who dances away in disappointment. Roz notices Annie is constantly checking her phone, and asks if she's already found someone new. Annie admits that she met someone on the internet, specifically from Duncan's blog on Tucker Crowe. Roz is disappointed, as she assumes that Annie has fallen for another Tucker fanboy, but Annie explains that she's been emailing the actual Tucker Crowe. Just then, the dancing drunk man approaches Annie again for a dance, and this time she reluctantly accepts as she dances the night away, finally free from her torrid relationship with Duncan. The next morning, Annie wakes up to her phone going off, hungover from the night before. She opens her eyes to read an email from Tucker, who has sent an email informing her that he is on his way to London, as his grandchild is due sooner than expected. Annie replies that she was coincidentally on her way to London to meet an old friend anyway, which isn't true. The two of them agree to meet at the Tate Modern at 5 p.m. However, Tucker collapses before getting there and needs medical attention. Annie is waiting at a cafe by herself. The day passes by, and Tucker never arrives. Later, Annie receives a phone call while she's on the train. She answers to find that Tucker is calling her, and he apologizes for not being able to make it, as he ended up having a heart attack. Annie asks if he's okay, which Tucker confirms he is, and asks Annie if she would visit him at the hospital instead. Annie rushes over to the hospital and is pleased to meet Tucker for the first time, admitting that it's strange to finally meet him in person. Tucker is lying in the bed, laughing and in a stable condition. She hands him over 2 books, which Tucker is very thankful for. Just then, Jackson comes in and is introduced to Annie by Tucker. The two of them go off to a cafe as Tucker is seen by a medical professional. At the cafe, Jackson and Annie talk to one another, and Jackson expresses his concern for his father's health, asking whether or not heart attacks can be caused by bumpy plane flights. Annie is unsure what to say, other than they may contribute to such occurrences. Annie takes Jackson back to Tucker's room, where Lizzie, who's just given birth recently, has come to visit her father with her boyfriend. Tucker introduces Lizzie to Annie and explains that she is his new friend whom he met on a website. Lizzie is confused by this, but Annie assures her that it isn't the kind of website she is thinking of. Annie tries to take her leave, but before she can do so, she is stopped by Tucker, who says that he wants to speak to her. Just then, 2 twin boys named Cooper and Jesse walk into the room, whom Tucker introduces to Lizzie as they're her half-brothers. Tucker is confused as to how they arrived at the hospital, and Lizzie explains that she got in contact with their mother, Carrie. Tucker isn't happy about that, as he and Carrie are likely on bad terms. Carrie then walks in, carrying a bouquet of flowers, and throws them at Tucker, voicing her frustration over the fact she had to spend $10,000 on a plane ticket, and Tucker looks fine. Carrie and Tucker break into an argument after Tucker asks how Carrie's new partner Doug is doing, to which Carrie responds that he is training for a triathlon and knows that exercise is a trigger for Tucker. Just then, Lizzie's mother Natalie walks into the room with her partner, Mark, who seems happy to see Tucker, though the feeling doesn't seem mutual. Tucker introduces them to Annie, and then Lizzie reveals that she invited someone called Grace as well, which Tucker is also not pleased to hear. Tucker asks Lizzie if she is angry with him, as it seems that she is punishing him by inviting all his problems into one room. And Lizzie reveals she is angry that Tucker pretends that they all don't exist, pointing out that he likely came to England to see Annie, and not her and his grandchild. Lizzie is unhappy that her father has taken so much time to introduce her to her siblings, and that it took him to have a heart attack for them to meet in the first place. Tucker begins to get stressed, and Jackson pleads with his father for him to rest. Lizzie's boyfriend begins singing, to calm the tension in the room, as Annie slowly sneaks out. As Annie is leaving the hospital, she spots Jackson sitting in the waiting area on his own, looking down. As she approaches him, Jackson looks up and asks her whose mom she is, thinking she may be the mother of some other siblings that he has yet to meet. Annie assures him she's nobody's mom, bids Jackson farewell, and takes her leave. While in a taxi, Annie receives a phone call from Tucker, who has managed to get out of his bed. He apologizes that she had to witness his insane family situation when she came there just to see him. The two of them talk it over and agree to try to meet again, this time without all of Tucker's exes and children present. Sometime in the future, when Tucker is discharged from the hospital, Annie comes to meet him and Jackson. Tucker suggests that they visit Annie's hometown, Sandcliffe, which surprises Annie, who finds her hometown very boring. Tucker explains that he feels as if it would be a great place to recover after his heart attack, and that Jackson would be interested in visiting Annie's museum. The three of them eventually arrive in Sandcliffe by train, and then take a taxi to Annie's home, which she shared with Duncan. Once inside, Annie helps Jackson use the bathroom while Tucker takes a look around. After Jackson is done, Annie finds Tucker looking through Duncan's room dedicated to him, and Annie tries her best to explain. Tucker deduces that her ex-boyfriend Duncan built this shrine dedicated to him, although he also feels used, as it seems Annie is planning to parade him as a trophy to get back at her ex. Annie convinces Tucker that this is not the case, and that it was Tucker's idea to come to Sandcliffe in the first place. Later that night, Annie tries to call Duncan, though he doesn't pick up and she leaves him a message. The next morning, Annie, Tucker, and Jackson are at the beach when they're spotted by Duncan, who is on a run with Gina. Duncan spots Annie from a distance and explains to Gina that he should go meet Annie, or she would be devastated that he ignored her after seeing her. Duncan greets Annie, and she tries to explain that she's there with Tucker, but Duncan doesn't let her get a word in, and instead begins apologizing for everything he did. Just then, Tucker comes over and introduces himself, and Duncan is in shock, even refusing to acknowledge that it's a possibility that this could be the real Tucker Crow. Duncan angrily walks off, and Tucker and Annie laugh over the encounter. While sitting with Gina, Duncan is furious that Annie is going out with a man who is old enough to be her father. He is convinced that Tucker does not have a son, as there were no online rumors that pointed towards him having a son. Gina assures Duncan that Annie is just trying to annoy him, and asks him if the man even resembles Tucker, to which Duncan pulls a picture of Tucker from a box, and is hesitant to say no. Frustrated and angry, Duncan declares that he's going to have a shower. Meanwhile, back at her place, Annie is reading to Jackson, and Tucker notes that she's good with children. He asks her if she's ever thought about having any of her own, to which she responds that she wouldn't know where to start. She in return asks Tucker why his daughter Grace's name bothers him, and Tucker explains that he isn't bothered by her, but rather, he hasn't ever met her. Annie is confused about how he could possibly not have ever met his daughter, but just then, they're interrupted by someone sneaking around the window. She immediately realizes it's Duncan, and before he could notice, Annie is standing outside watching him. Once inside, Annie and Duncan enter the kitchen, where Tucker is cooking. Duncan apologizes to Tucker for his rudeness earlier, which Tucker accepts. However, Duncan is still reluctant to fully accept that Tucker is who he says he is, and Tucker offers to show him his passport. Duncan is stunned into silence as he stares at the passport, and it's confirmed to him that he is standing in the same room as the man he has idolized for so long. Annie interjects and asks Duncan if he would like to stay for dinner, which he immediately agrees to. At dinner, Duncan can't help but dive into his obsession with Tucker. He bombards his idol with questions, and even goes far as to claim to know a lot about him. Tucker responds by informing him that most of what he's read online about him is far from reality, denying that he had children with any Swedish royalty, which was one of the theories about him online. Duncan continues and monologues about how much Tucker's music means to him, and how much of a genius he believes he is, though this annoys Tucker, who is very critical of himself and his work. This hurts Duncan, who feels like he's overstayed his welcome. Before he leaves, he explains to Tucker that he still thinks that his music is a work of art, even if he doesn't believe so himself, and that people usually don't value things that they obtained easily, echoing how he feels about Annie now. The next day, Tucker and Annie are stood together, looking out to sea while Jackson plays on the beach. Tucker reveals why he skipped out on his last ever show. When he was set to go on, his ex Julie came into the bathroom where Tucker and handed him a baby, a girl named Grace, revealing to him that he was the father. Tucker goes on to explain the fear he felt as soon as he was faced with serious responsibility for the first time in his life, and decided to abandon Grace and the show. He now regrets what he did, and feels as if he shouldn't be allowed to live a happy life, as he failed his firstborn. Since that moment, Tucker has always felt that he has no right to play the sad songs about having his heart broken, when he did worse to his by abandoning her in a bathroom. That night, Tucker finally musters up the courage to call Grace. However, when she answers the call, Grace isn't so happy to hear her biological father call her, after all these years. Grace even informs Tucker that she has a father, and she does not care that her adoptive father is not her biological father. She ends the call by stating that whatever Tucker has going on, she does not want to be involved in it. Tucker, disappointed and humbled, and thanks her before he hangs up. The next morning, Tucker and Annie head over to the museum, where they attend Annie's long-awaited Summer of '64 exhibition. Many people are present, and Terry is speaking to Tucker, shocked to hear that he's a famous American rock star. He asks Tucker if he would like to drink, though Tucker is insistent that he shouldn't, as he is a recovering alcoholic. Terry runs off to get him a beer anyway, while Roz runs to get him water instead, which Tucker thanks her for. Later that day, Tucker introduces Annie to an elderly woman named Edna. Annie introduces herself to Edna, who explains that she is one of the women in a photo Annie has put up as part of the exhibition. Edna reminisces about the summer of '64, pointing out the man she is with in the photo, and how she regrets not having as much fun as she should have in her younger years. As Edna leaves, this gets Annie thinking, and she immediately turns to Tucker and asks him if he would be interested in her. Tucker states that he is indeed interested in her, though his confidence in these sorts of things has taken a hit, so he didn't come out and say so earlier. Suddenly, everyone in the room has their attention diverted to Terry, who has got up on a stage and announced that they have a famous American musician here today, who has come to play for them. Annie immediately apologizes to Tucker, explaining that she had no idea that Terry was going to do this. Terry carries on, even claiming that Tucker is a member of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and Annie keeps apologizing to Tucker as Terry keeps up spouting nonsense. However, Tucker walks onto the stage and informs everyone he is not in the Hall of Fame, nor has he won any Grammys. He calmly sits down at a keyboard, before admitting that he's nervous, and begins playing, stating that he didn't write this song, but wishes he had. Tucker says that he thought of this song while he was at Waterloo Station with a friend, by which he means Annie. As he begins to sing, the room is stunned into silence, and Duncan comes into the room and stands next to Annie as he gets to finally watch his idol perform. Back at home, Jackson falls asleep on the couch with Tucker, while Annie has a drink in the kitchen. Tucker enters the kitchen, and he and Annie begin to kiss, and end up going upstairs into the bedroom, though they're suddenly interrupted by Jackson, who has just awoken and been sick. Tucker immediately exits the room to help his son. As the two of them are sat together, Annie joins them, and Jackson asks his father when they're going back home, as he misses his mother, to which Tucker responds they're going back home soon. The next day, Tucker and Annie are taking a stroll on the beach, and Tucker asks Annie if the two of them can ever be together. She thinks they cannot, as Jackson has to be with his mother, and he has to be with Jackson. Tucker is disappointed at this, as he believes their relationship has just begun. Annie admits that when Tucker leaves, everything will be worse, but that she enjoyed the brief fantasy. Tucker, Annie, and Jackson then take a road trip to London, where Tucker wants to see Lizzie and his grandchild before he leaves for America. Lizzie opens the door with her baby in her arms, in tears, revealing to her father that her boyfriend has left her and his child. Tucker embraces his daughter and holds his grandson, as Annie watches from afar. She walks over to Lizzie and Tucker and bids them farewell, after congratulating Lizzie, but keeps looking back at Tucker as she finds it difficult to leave. Lizzie gets in her car and drives off, crying, as she heads back to Sandcliffe. One night, Annie is at a bar with Roz, who is showing her a girl that asked her out. Just then, Duncan, who is staring through the window to see if Annie is there, comes and sits next to Annie. He informs her that he has turned down the job he was offered at Bristol University, which shocks Annie, as he always wanted to get a job at a good university. Duncan then asks her if she wants to get back together, as he believes they broke up for a silly reason, though Annie disagrees, reminding him that they broke up because he cheated on her. Annie then asks him if his wanting to get back together with her has something to do with Tucker Crow being romantically interested in her. Duncan doesn't deny this, but instead claims that Tucker opened his eyes. Annie replies that she doesn't want what Duncan wants, and that she has long since moved on, which leaves Duncan disappointed. A year later, Annie has moved to London, where she landed a job in an art gallery. She still speaks to Tucker via email, and informs him that she's delighted that he has finally obtained his own place, and that she has looked into having a baby on her own. She tells him that if he's ever in London again, she would like to meet for a coffee. Just then, as she's walking down a busy London road, she sees Tucker sat inside a coffee shop across the street. Tucker spots her staring at him. He smiles and stands up as Annie runs over.